The Galactic Empire had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and nobody had ever challenged them, and nobody had ever survived trying, and the Empire believed this would never change. They were wrong. Admiral Park Tae-han stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance and watched the stars stretch and twist as the ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and for a moment, everything was silent and beautiful and terrifying all at once. This was humanity's first journey beyond their own solar system, and Tae-han felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on his shoulders like a mountain. Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna sat at her console, and her fingers moved quickly across the controls as she scanned the space around them, and her eyes went wide when she saw what was waiting for them. "Sir," she said, and her voice was quiet and tense, and Tae-han could hear the fear she was trying to hide, and he turned to look at her. Display, there was a ship out there, and it was not human. The vessel was massive and covered in strange symbols, and it glowed with an energy that Tae-han had never seen before, and his heart began to beat faster, but he kept his face calm, because his crew needed him to be calm. Chief Engineer Lee Hyen-woo stepped up beside him and let out a low whistle as he stared at the alien ship on the screen. "That thing is at least 10 times our size," he said, and Tae-han nodded slowly. "I can see that," he replied, and his voice was steady, even though his mind was racing. The alien ship was beautiful in a terrible way, and it looked like it had been built by beings who had never known defeat and never imagined they could lose, and Tae-han wondered what kind of creatures lived inside that metal giant. On the other side of space, the Imperial patrol vessel Endless Dominion had detected the human ship, and Captain Varth stood on his own bridge and stared at the strange vessel with confusion and disgust. His 4 eyes blinked one after another as he studied the primitive-looking ship, and he could not understand how it had appeared from nowhere, and he could not understand the technology it had used to travel. "This is impossible," he muttered, and his first officer Kellax moved closer. "Captain," Kellax said, and his voice was careful and respectful, "and the vessel does not match any known species in our database, and it appears to have used some form of faster-than-light travel that we have never encountered." Vorath made a sound of displeasure, and his scales shifted color from calm blue to angry red, and he did not like things he could not understand, and he did not like surprises. "Scan them," he ordered, and his crew obeyed immediately. Back on the Defiance, Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna reported what she was seeing, and her voice was tight with tension. "They are scanning us, sir," she said, and Tae-han nodded. "Let them," he replied, and his voice was calm and strong. "And we came here to make contact, not to fight, and we will show them we mean no harm." Science Officer Choi Yoonbi looked up from her station, and her face was pale but determined, and she had spent her whole life dreaming of this moment, and now that it was here, she felt like she might throw up. "Sir," she said, "and maybe we should try to communicate with them, and I can attempt to send a greeting on multiple frequencies." Tae-han considered this for a moment, and then nodded. "And do it," he said, "and let them know we come in peace." Yoonbi worked quickly, and her message went out into the void, and it carried humanity's first words to an alien species, and those words were simple and hopeful and full of the dream that had driven humanity to the stars. "We are humans from the planet Earth, and we come in peace, and we wish to learn and share and grow together." The message reached the Endless Dominion, and Captain Vorath listened to it, and his 4 eyes narrowed with suspicion and contempt. And he did not care about peace, and he did not care about sharing. The Empire had a protocol for dealing with unknown species, and that protocol was simple and brutal, and it had served them well for thousands of years. "Destroy first, and ask questions, never fire," Vorath commanded, and his weapons officer obeyed without hesitation. The energy blast that erupted from the Endless Dominion was powerful enough to destroy a small moon, and it streaked across space toward the Defiance, and everyone on the human ship watched it come, and for a moment time seemed to stop. Navigation Officer Baek Jisoo shouted a warning, and her hands flew to her controls, but there was no time to dodge and no time to run, and all they could do was trust their shields. The blast hit the Defiance, and the ship shook violently in alarms, began to scream, and crew members grabbed onto whatever they could find, and Tae-Hyan braced himself against his command chair, but the shields held. The energy that should have vaporized them instead splashed against the protective barrier like water against a rock, and the Defiance rocked and trembled, but it did not break, and it did not die. Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna stared at her console in disbelief, and shields holding at 62%, she reported, and her voice cracked with shock and relief. On the Endless Dominion, Captain Vorath could not believe what he was seeing, and his scales turned white with fear and confusion, and this had never happened before, and no primitive species had ever survived an Imperial attack. How Kellex whispered, and his voice was barely audible. Vorath did not answer because he had no answer to give. Admiral Park Tae-Hyan stood straight, and his face had changed, and the calm patience was gone, and in its place was something hard and cold and dangerous. "They fired on us," he said, and his voice was quiet and deadly. "And we came in peace, and they tried to kill us." The bridge was silent, except for the sound of alarms, and every crew member waited for their admiral's command, and they knew what was coming, and they were ready. Weapons Officer Han Dong-yuk looked at Tae-Hyan, and his hands hovered over his controls. And he had trained for this moment his whole life, and he had hoped it would never come, and now it was here. "Sir Han," Dong-yuk said, and Tae-Hyan met his eyes. "Return fire," Tae-Han ordered, and one round only. Han Dong-yuk pressed the button, and a single railgun round launched from the Defiance, and it traveled at 12% the speed of light, and it crossed the distance between the two ships in less than a heartbeat. The round hit the Endless Dominion and punched through its hull like a needle through paper, and it kept going, and it tore through deck after deck, and it did not stop until it exited the other side. Captain Vorath had exactly 2 seconds to understand what had happened, and then the secondary explosions began, and fire bloomed inside his ship, and the Endless Dominion died in a flash of light and metal. And screaming Admiral Park Tae-Han watched the alien ship break apart, and he felt no joy and no satisfaction, and only a deep and terrible sadness. "We came in peace," he said quietly, "and they chose war." Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna turned to look at him, and her eyes were wet with tears she refused to let fall. "And what do we do now, sir?" she asked. Tae-Han was silent for a long moment, and he thought about Earth, and he thought about the billions of people who had no idea what had just happened, and he thought about the future that had suddenly become very dangerous. "Now," he said, and his voice was heavy with the weight of what was to come, "and now we find out who they are and what we are up against." Chief Engineer Lee Hyanwoo ran his hands through his hair. "And they are not going to be happy about this," he said, and Tae-Han almost laughed. "No," Tae-Han agreed, "and they are not." The Defiance turned away from the debris field that had once been an Imperial warship, and it moved deeper into unknown space, and behind it the wreckage drifted and spun, and somewhere in the vast network of the Galactic Empire an alarm began to sound. The Empire had just learned that they were not alone, and they had just learned that this new species could fight back, and they had just received their first lesson about humanity. It would not be their last. The message reached the Imperial capital world in less than an hour, and it spread through the halls of power like fire through dry grass, and soon every high official knew what had happened, and soon every admiral and general and minister was summoned to the throne room. High Sovereign Malachi sat upon his throne of black crystal, and he watched the holographic recording play again and again, and his ancient face showed no emotion, but his mind was burning with rage and confusion. The recording showed the patrol vessel Endless Dominion firing upon a small and primitive-looking ship, and it showed that ship surviving the attack, and it showed that ship returning fire with a single shot, and it showed the Endless Dominion dying in a bloom of fire and destruction. One ship, Fleet Marshal Drawn, whispered, and his 4 eyes were wide with disbelief, and one ship destroyed a patrol cruiser with a single shot. Malachi raised one clawed hand and the room fell silent, and his voice was cold and ancient. When he spoke, "Tell me everything about this species," he commanded. Intelligence Minister Sarath stepped forward, and her scales were pale with fear, and she had spent the last hour searching every database in the Empire, and what she had found disturbed her deeply. "High Sovereign," she began, and her voice trembled slightly, "and we have records of their star system, and it was surveyed 10,000 years ago and marked as unsuitable for colonization." "Why?" Malachi demanded. Sarath swallowed hard. "And the survey team reported that the native population was dangerously unstable and prone to extreme violence, and they recommended avoiding the system." Enter Elidron made a sound of disbelief. "And dangerously unstable," he repeated, "and they are primitives." "And how can primitives be dangerous to us?" Malachi silenced him with a look, and the High Sovereign had ruled for 3,000 years, and he had not survived that long by underestimating his enemies. "Continue," he ordered. Sarath nodded. "And the species calls themselves humans, and they appear to have developed faster than light travel using a method we have never seen, and their weapons are also unknown to us, and based on the recording, their shields are remarkably effective." Lakay leaned back in his throne, and his eyes were cold and calculating. And he had conquered 1,000 species, and he had crushed 1,000 rebellions, and he would not let one small ship threaten his empire. "Send the 3rd battle fleet," he commanded, "and find this ship and destroy it, and bring me proof of its death." Fleet Marshal Drawn bowed deeply. "And it will be done." "High Sovereign," he said, and he turned and left the throne room, and his mind was already planning the hunt. The 3rd battle fleet was one of the most powerful forces in the Empire, and it consisted of 2,000 warships, and each of those ships was larger and more powerful than the Endless Dominion, and Drawn believed the hunt would be quick and easy. He was wrong. Far across the galaxy, the USS Defiance moved through space like a ghost, and Admiral Park Taehyun stood in the command center and studied the data his crew had collected. Chief Engineer Lee Hyun-woo had finished his damage assessment, and his report was not encouraging. "Shields held, sir," he said, "but they took a beating, and we need time to make repairs, and if we take another hit like that, we might not survive." Taehyun nodded slowly, and his face was calm, but his mind was racing, and he knew they were in a very dangerous situation. "How long for repairs?" he asked. In-woo ran his hands through his hair. "And 12 hours minimum," he said, "and maybe longer if we run into trouble." Science Officer Choi Yoonbi looked up from her station, and her face was tired, but determined, and she had been analyzing the alien ship since the battle ended. "Sir," she said, "and I have been studying the wreckage, and their technology is advanced, but not as advanced as I expected, and their weapons are powerful, but their shields are weaker than ours, and their ships are fast, but not as maneuverable." Ahain raised an eyebrow. "And what does that tell you?" Umbi hesitated. "And it tells me they have not had to fight a real war in a very long time, and they have grown comfortable and overconfident, and they believe they are unbeatable." Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna turned from her console, and her eyes were dark with worry. "And sir," she said, "and I am detecting multiple ships heading in our direction, and they are still far away." "But they are coming fast." "How many?" Taehyun asked Yuna. "Checked the readings and swallowed hard, and thousands," she said. The bridge fell silent, and every crew member felt the weight of that number pressing down on them, and they were one ship against an empire, and the odds were impossible. But Admiral Park Taehyun did not believe in impossible. "We did not come here to start a war," he said, and his voice was steady and strong, but we will not run from one either, and if they want to fight, then we will teach them what humans can do." Navigation Officer Beek Jisoo looked up from her station. "And sir," she said, "and where do we go?" Hyun studied the star charts on the main display, and his mind worked through the options, and he made his decision. "Quickly, we go forward," he said, "and not back, and we need to learn everything we can about this empire, and we need to find their weaknesses and we need to survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Strategic. Officer Kwon Sung-ho stepped forward. And his face was thoughtful. And sir, he said, and reinforcements are at least 3 months away, and that is a long time to survive. Against thousands of ships, Taehan smiled, and it was not a friendly smile, and then we will have to be very clever. He said, the Defiance changed course and moved deeper into Imperial territory, and behind them the third battle fleet began its pursuit, and the hunt was on over. The following days, Admiral Park Taehan pushed his crew to their limits, and they worked without rest, and they learned everything they could about the Empire. They had stumbled into weapons. Officer Han Dong-yuk studied the alien weapons and found ways to counter them, and Chief Medical Officer Shin Mi-rae prepared for the casualties she knew were coming, and Chief Engineer Lee Hyen-woo coaxed every bit of power from the ship systems. Slowly the picture of the Galactic Empire became clear. They were old, and they were powerful, and they had conquered hundreds of thousands of worlds, and they had crushed every species that had ever opposed them, and they believed they were invincible. But Choi Yun-bi had been right about them, and they had not faced a real challenge in millennia, and they had grown arrogant and complacent. And they had forgotten what it meant to fight an enemy who would not surrender. Admiral Park Tae-hyun gathered his senior officers in the briefing room, and he looked at each of them, and he saw the fear in their eyes, and he saw the determination. Underneath it, we are alone, he said, and we are outnumbered, and we are outgunned, and by every measure we should lose this fight. He paused, and his eyes were hard and bright. But we are human, he continued, and humans do not know how to quit, and we have been fighting against impossible odds since we climbed down from the trees, and we have never stopped fighting, and we never will. Lieutenant. Commander Kim Yuna straightened her shoulders. And what are your orders, sir? Shiasuke Tae-hyun smiled. And we are going to make them regret ever firing on us, he said, and we are going to hit them so hard they will never forget our name, and we are going to show them what happens when you try to kill humans. Officers around the table nodded, and their fear was still there, but it was buried now under something stronger and something fiercer, and they were ready. The hunt had begun, and the Empire believed they were the hunters. They were about to learn that humans could be hunters too. 6 weeks passed, and the third battle fleet hunted the human ship across the stars, and they expected a quick victory. And they expected to crush these primitive creatures and return home as heroes. Instead, they found only death and confusion and fear. Admiral Park Tae-hyun used every trick that humanity had learned in thousands of years of warfare, and he used ambushes and feints and misdirection, and he turned the vast emptiness of space into a killing ground. The first major engagement happened near an asteroid field, and Fleet Marshal Dron had tracked the Defiance to this region, and he sent 50 destroyers to corner the human ship and destroy it. Destroyers entered the asteroid field in perfect formation, and their captains were confident and eager for glory, and they scanned the tumbling rocks for any sign of their prey weapons. Officer Han Dong-yuk waited in the darkness, and he had positioned the Defiance behind a massive asteroid, and he had spent hours calculating trajectories and angles, and he was ready. Now he said the Defiance fired, and the railgun rounds streaked through the void, and they hit the first destroyer before its crew even knew they were under attack, and the ship exploded in a flash of light and fire. The other destroyers tried to respond, but Han Dong-yuk was already moving, and the Defiance weaved through the asteroids like a dancer, and it fired again and again, and each shot found its target. Navigation Officer Baek Ji-soo guided the ship through impossible gaps, and her hands were steady on the controls, and her eyes never blinked, and she flew like she had been born in the cockpit. The Imperial captains tried to pursue, but their ships were too large and too slow, and the asteroids that they Defiance slipped between became obstacles that the destroyers crashed into. When the battle ended, 12 destroyers were dead, and the rest were fleeing, and the Defiance had not taken a single hit. Fleet Marshal Dron received the news in his scales. turned white with shock and rage, and he could not understand how this was happening, and he could not understand how one ship could cause so much damage. Send more ships, he commanded, and surround the entire sector, and do not let them escape. But the Defiance was already gone, and Admiral Park Taehan had anticipated this response, and he had slipped away while the survivors were still counting their dead. The second major engagement happened near a gas giant, and Taehan had led the Imperial fleet into a trap, and they did not realize it until it was too late. Chief Engineer Lee Hyenwoo had modified the ship's sensors, and he had found a way to use the gas giant's magnetic field to hide their presence, and the Defiance waited in the swirling clouds like a predator, waiting for prey. A squadron of cruisers entered the gas giant's atmosphere, and they were searching for the human ship, and they were confident that their numbers would protect them. Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna watched them approach, and she counted the ships, and she calculated the odds, and her voice was calm when she spoke. 15 cruisers, sir, she reported, and they are spreading out in a search pattern. Admiral Park Taehan nodded, and he watched the display, and he waited for the perfect moment. Chief Medical Officer Shin Mai-rei stood ready in the medical bay, and her team was prepared for casualties, and she hoped they would not be needed. But she knew better than to count on hope. The cruisers came closer, and they still could not detect the Defiance, and their captains were growing frustrated and careless now. Taehan said, Defiance erupted from the clouds, and it fired a barrage of missiles, and the missiles streaked toward the cruisers, and they detonated. In a chain of explosions that lit up the gas giant's atmosphere, 4 cruisers died in the first seconds, and the rest tried to flee, but the Defiance was faster, and Han Dong-yuk picked them off one by one, and his aim was perfect, and his heart was cold. When it was over, 11 cruisers were destroyed, and 4 had escaped, and the Defiance had taken only minor damage. This pattern continued for weeks, and the Defiance struck and vanished and struck again, and the third battle fleet grew smaller. With each engagement, Admiral Park Taehan never fought fair, and he never gave the Empire a chance to use their superior numbers, and he turned their strength into weakness and their confidence into fear. Strategic Officer Kwon Sung-ho helped plan each attack, and he studied the Imperial tactics, and he found the patterns in their behavior, and he exploited every mistake they made. The Imperial commanders are rigid, he reported, and they follow the same protocols every time, and they do not adapt. And they do not learn. Taehan nodded, and that is their greatest weakness, he said. And they have not had to adapt in thousands of years, and they have forgotten how. Science Officer Choi Yumbi monitored Imperial communications, and she began to detect something interesting in the transmission, sir, she said, and her voice was excited. And I am hearing reports from other Imperial fleets, and they are being pulled from their regular patrols to join the hunt for you. Taehan raised an eyebrow, and how? Man Yumbi checked their data, and dozens of fleets from across the Empire, and they are calling it the largest mobilization in centuries. The bridge crew exchanged glances, and Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna spoke what everyone was thinking. We are one ship, she said, and they are sending dozens of fleets after us, and that seems like a lot. Hyen smiled, and it is a lot, he agreed, and it means they are scared, and it means we are hurting them, and it means we are winning. But he knew they could not keep this up forever, and their ammunition was running low, and their crew was exhausted, and the Empire had endless resources to throw at them. Chief Engineer Lee Hyenwoo reported that the engines were showing strain, and the shields needed more repairs, and the ship was holding together through willpower and skill, but it could not. Last Admiral Taehan made a decision, and he called his senior officers together, and he told them his plan. We cannot defeat the entire Empire by ourselves, he said. But we do not need to, and we only need to survive until reinforcements arrive. And we need to gather as much intelligence as possible. He paused and looked at each of them. And there is something else, he continued, and I have been studying the Imperial Communications, and I have noticed something interesting. Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna leaned forward. And what is it, Sir Dahayan? Pulled up a display showing a map of Imperial territory, and there are hundreds of conquered species in this empire, he said, and not all of them are happy about it. Strategic Officer Quan Sung-ho understood immediately. And you want to start a rebellion, he said. Taehyun shook his head. And I want to offer hope, he said, and I want to show the conquered peoples that the empire can be beaten, and I want to give them a reason to fight for their freedom. It was a bold plan, and it was dangerous, and if it failed, they would die. But if it succeeded, they might change the galaxy forever. The hunt continued, and the Defiance kept fighting, and the Empire kept losing ships, and somewhere in the vast darkness of space, a message of hope began to spread. The humans were coming, and they could not be stopped. For the first time in millennia, the Galactic Empire began to feel something it had forgotten: fear. Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna worked through the night, and her eyes burned from staring at screens, and her fingers ached from typing commands, but she did not stop, because she was close to a breakthrough. For weeks, she had been studying the Imperial communication systems, and she had been searching for a way to crack their encryption, and now finally she had found it, sir. She called out, and her voice was hoarse, but triumphant. And I have done it. Admiral Park Taehyun crossed the bridge to her station, and he looked at the streams of decoded text flowing across her screen, and his eyes widened as he realized what he was seeing. You broke their encryption, he said. Yuna nodded, and she allowed herself a small smile. And every message in the Empire is now open to us, she said, and military communications and government orders and everything. This changed everything, and Taehyun knew it immediately, and he called for his senior officers, and they gathered around Yuna's station, and they began to read the secrets of the Galactic Empire. What they found was both horrifying and hopeful. The Empire had conquered more than 500 different species over the past 12,000 years, and those species had been enslaved and exploited and treated as less than nothing, and their cultures had been destroyed, and their histories erased. But the conquered peoples had not forgotten who they were, and they had not stopped dreaming of freedom, and in secret, they whispered about rebellion, and in secret, they waited for a chance. Science Officer Choi Yoonbi read through the reports, and her face grew pale with anger. And they are monsters, she said, and they have committed atrocities on a scale I cannot even comprehend. Strategic Officer Quan Sung-ho studied the military intelligence, and he saw something that made him lean forward with interest. Sir, he said, and look at this, and the third battle fleet has lost almost 400 ships trying to catch you. Taehyun nodded, and he had known they were winning, but he had not realized by how much. Sung-ho continued, and the Imperial High Command is panicking, and they have never lost this many ships to a single enemy, and they do not know what to do. Chief Engineer Lee Hyanwoo pointed to another report, and they are pulling ships from everywhere, he said, and they are leaving entire sectors undefended, and the conquered worlds are. Noticing Admiral Park Taehyun stood silent for a long moment, and his mind was working through the possibilities, and he was seeing a path that he had not seen before. We cannot defeat the Empire alone, he said slowly, but we do not have to. Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna looked at him. And what do you mean? Sir Taehyun turned to face his crew, and his eyes were bright with determination. And the conquered peoples want to be free, he said, and they have been waiting for a chance, and we are going to give them that chance. He outlined his plan, and it was audacious, and it was dangerous, and it might get them all killed, but it was also the best hope they had. We are going to find a world that wants to be free, he said, and we are going to show them that the Empire can be beaten, and we are going to light a fire that will spread across the galaxy. Navigation Officer Baek Jisoo pulled up the star charts, and her fingers traced across the display. And where do we go? She asked Choi. Yoonbi had been researching the conquered species, and she had found one that interested her. Volantis Prime, she said, and the Lanti were conquered 3,000 years ago, and they were a proud and peaceful people, and they have never stopped resisting. She pulled up information about the Volanti, and images appeared on the screen showing tall, graceful beings with silver skin and large, dark eyes. The Empire has tried to break them for 3 millennia. Yumbi continued, and they have failed, and the Volanti still remember their freedom, and they still want it back. Taehyun made his decision and set course for Volantis Prime. He ordered. The Defiance changed direction, and it moved through space toward a world it had never seen, and toward a people it had never met, and toward a destiny that none of them could have imagined. The journey took 3 days, and during that time Admiral Park Taehyun prepared his message, and he wrote and rewrote the words until they were perfect, and he practiced speaking them until they flowed naturally. When they arrived at Volantis Prime, the crew was tense and ready for battle, and they expected the Empire to be waiting for them. But the Imperial garrison was small, and it was unprepared, and the ships guarding the planet were old and slow, and Taehyun realized that the Empire had pulled most of its forces away to hunt for the Defiance. This is our chance, he said. Before the garrison could respond, the Defiance broadcast a message on all frequencies, and it was heard on the surface of Volantis Prime, and it was heard on ships throughout the sector, and it was heard on 10,000 worlds across the Empire. People of the galaxy, the message began, and we are humans, and we come from a world called Earth, and we do not seek conquest, and we do not bow to tyrants. Admiral Park Taehyun spoke with passion and conviction, and his words carried the weight of humanity's hopes. The Empire has told you that resistance is futile, the message continued, and they have told you that they cannot be beaten, and they have told you that you will be slaves forever. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was fierce and proud. They are wrong. Our one ship, and we have destroyed 400 of their warships, and we have fought them for 6 weeks, and we are still here, and we are still fighting. Message spread like wildfire, and it was heard by the Volanti on their homeworld, and they stopped what they were doing, and they listened. Any species that wishes freedom will find allies in humanity, Taehyun declared, and we will stand with you, and we will fight with you, and we will die with you, if that is what it takes. The Empire is not invincible, and they can bleed, and they can lose, and they can fall, and today is the day you start believing that on the surface of Volantis Prime, a Volanti elder named Coraville listened to the message, and tears streamed down her silver face, and she had waited her entire life for this moment. She turned to the others gathered around her, and her voice was strong and clear. The humans are right, she said, and we have been slaves long enough, and it is time to remember who we are, and it is time to fight. The Imperial garrison on Volantis Prime sent a distress call, but it was too late, and the Volanti rose up with a fury that had been building for 3,000 years, and they overwhelmed their oppressors with sheer numbers and determination. The Defiance provided support from orbit and weapons. Officer Han Dong-hyuk destroyed the Imperial ships before they could escape, and Chief Medical Officer Shin Mai-rei coordinated with Volanti healers to treat the wounded. By the end of the day, Volantis Prime was free, but the message had traveled far beyond one world, and other species heard it, and other peoples began to stir, and the fire that Admiral Park Taehyun had wanted to light was burning high. Sovereign Malachi received reports of unrest on dozens of worlds, and his advisors were panicking, and his generals were demanding more ships, and his empire was beginning to crack. One ship, Intelligence Minister Sereth whispered, and one ship has done all of this. Malachi rose from his throne, and his ancient face was twisted with fury. And assemble every ship in the Empire, he commanded, and we will crush these humans, and we will burn every world that has listened to them, and we will restore order. The largest fleet in Imperial history began to gather, and it would number 50,000 warships, and it would be led by Malachi himself, and it would hunt down the Defiance and destroy it. But Admiral Park Taehyun was not afraid, because he knew something that Malachi did not. Reinforcements were coming. The 3 months were almost over, and humanity's first fleet was on its way, and the galaxy was about to change forever. High Sovereign Malachi stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and he watched as his armada assembled around him, and the sight filled him with dark satisfaction. 50,000 warships stretched across space in every direction, and they were the most powerful force ever gathered in the history of the Empire, and they were coming for the humans. This ends today, Malachi declared, and his voice echoed through the vast bridge, and we will destroy these primitives, and we will burn their allies, and we will remind the galaxy why they should fear us. Fleet Marshal Drawn stood beside him, and his scales were dark with shame because he had failed to catch the Defiance, and he had lost 400 ships trying, and now the High Sovereign himself had come to finish the job. The Armada moved toward Volantis Prime, where intelligence reports indicated the human ship was still hiding, and Malachi imagined the terror the humans would feel when they saw what was coming for them. But when the Imperial Armada arrived at Volantis Prime, they found something unexpected. The Defiance was there as expected, and Admiral Park Taehan stood on his bridge and watched a massive enemy fleet approach, and he should have been afraid. He was smiling. Sir, Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna said, and her voice was filled with wonder, and they are here. The space around Volantis Prime began to ripple and twist, and light bent in ways that hurt to look at, and then suddenly ships began to appear. Human ships, 12 of them, emerged from faster than light travel, and they formed up around the Defiance, and their weapons were hot, and their crews were ready, and leading them was the largest human vessel ever built, the USS Indomitable Fleet Admiral Yoon. Seojun stood on the bridge of his flagship, and he looked out at the Imperial Armada, and his face was calm and confident. Admiral Park, he said, and his voice carried across the communication channel, and I believe you requested reinforcement. Taehan laughed, and it was the first time he had laughed in months, and the sound echoed through the bridge of the Defiance, and his crew cheered it. It's good to see you, sir, Taehan replied. Seojun smiled, and it is good to be seen, and now, and shall we teach these Imperials a lesson? But the humans had not come alone. Behind the human fleet, more ships appeared, and these were not human vessels, and they were Volanti cruisers and Draven battleships and Kalmari frigates and ships from a dozen other species. The conquered peoples had heard Admiral Park Taehan's message, and they had risen up, and they had come to fight for their freedom. High Sovereign Malachi stared at the display, and his ancient face showed something it had not shown in 3,000 years. Fear. How he whispered, and where did they all come from? Fleet Marshal Drawn was already calculating the odds, and they were not as favorable as he had hoped, and the enemy fleet was smaller than his, but it was not small enough to guarantee victory. We still outnumber them, Drawn said, and his voice was uncertain, and we can still win. Malachi straightened, and his fear turned to rage and attack. He commanded, and destroy them all. The Battle of Volantis Prime began with fire and fury, and the two fleets crashed together like waves against rocks, and ships died on both sides in the opening moments. But something was different about this battle. The Imperial tactics were the same as they had always been, and they relied on overwhelming force and rigid formations and the assumption that their enemies would break and run. The humans did not break, and they did not run. Fleet Admiral Yoon Seojun commanded the human fleet with precision and creativity, and he used tactics that the Empire had never seen and could not counter. Admiral Park Taehan led strike groups deep into enemy formations, and the Defiance danced through the chaos, and weapons officer Han Dong-yuk destroyed ship after ship with deadly accuracy. Navigation officer Baek Jisoo performed maneuvers that should have been impossible, and she threaded the Defiance through gaps that seemed too small, and she kept them alive through sheer skill and determination. Chief Engineer Lee Hyenwoo coaxed miracles from the ship systems, and the shields held when they should have failed, and the engines burned when they should have died. Science Officer Choi Yoonbi coordinated with the allied species, and she translated commands and shared tactical data, and she helped the coalition fight. As one strategic officer, Quan Sung-ho, predicted Imperial movements before they happened, and he fed information to Admiral Park Tae-han, and every prediction proved correct. Chief Medical Officer Shin Mi-rae worked without rest, and she saved lives that would have been lost, and she refused to let a single crew member die if she could help it. And Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna monitored the entire battlefield, and she saw patterns that no one else could see, and she guided the fleet through the storm. The allied species fought with a fury that surprised even themselves, and they had waited millennia for this moment, and they were not going to waste it. The Volante cruisers struck with elegant precision, and the Draven battleships crashed into Imperial formations with brutal force, and the Kelmari frigates swarmed around enemy vessels and tore them apart hour after hour. The battle raged, and the Imperial Armada was ground down, and their ships died faster than they could kill, and their formations crumbled, and their confidence shattered. High Sovereign Malachi watched his fleet being destroyed, and he could not understand what was happening, and he could not accept that he was losing. Fight harder, he screamed, and do not retreat, and do not surrender. But his captains were dying, and his ships were burning, and his empire was falling apart around him. After 11 hours, it was over. The Imperial Armada was broken, and the survivors were fleeing, and High Sovereign Malachi sat alone on his bridge and watched his power disappear into the darkness of Space Fleet. Admiral Yoon Saijin opened a communication channel, and his voice was heard across the galaxy. "Attention, Galactic Empire," he said, "and this battle is over, and you have lost. And we offer you a choice." His voice was calm and steady, and filled with the confidence of victory. "You can surrender and accept peace, and we will help you build something better, and no more worlds will burn, and no more species will be enslaved. Or you can keep fighting, and we will keep winning, and eventually there will be nothing left of your empire but ashes and memories. The choice is yours." High Sovereign Malachi closed his eyes, and he thought about his empire, and he thought about his power, and he thought about the future, and then he did something he had never done in 3,000 years of rule. He surrendered. The war was over, and the Galactic Empire was no more. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed in ways that no one could have predicted, and the Galactic Federation rose from the ashes of the Empire, and it was a union of equals where every species had a voice. Admiral Park Tae-han became a legend, and his name was spoken with reverence on 1,000 worlds, and children learned about the ship that had started a revolution. The crew of the Defiance were honored as heroes, and they had done the impossible, and they had changed history, and they had shown the galaxy what humanity could do. The Defiance itself was preserved as a museum ship. It had orbited Volantis Prime as a symbol of hope and courage, and the refusal to surrender fleet. Admiral Yoon Sejun gave the final address at the founding of the Galactic Federation, and his words were broadcast to every world. "In known space, humanity did not come to the stars to conquer," he said, "and we came to explore and to learn and to grow, and we came to find friends. The age of empires is over, and the age of partnership has begun, and together we will build something greater than any of us could build alone." He paused and looked out at the representatives of 100 species, and his eyes were bright with it. Hope. "Welcome to the future." The galaxy cheered, and the future began, and somewhere on the bridge of the Defiance, Admiral Park Tae-han stood alone and looked out at the stars. They had come as strangers, and they had left as legends, and the universe would never be the same. Lieutenant Commander Kim Yuna found him there, and she stood beside him in silence. "What are you thinking about, sir?" she asked. Tae-han smiled, and he thought about Earth, and he thought about his crew, and he thought about all the species they had helped to free. "I am thinking," he said quietly, "and that we came in peace, and they chose war. And we gave them peace anyway." Yuna nodded, and she understood. "That is what makes us human," she said. "Yes," Tae-han agreed, "and that is exactly what makes us human. They stood together and watched the stars, and somewhere out there, new adventures were waiting. And new challenges were calling, and humanity was ready. The dawn had come, and it was beautiful.